The story of the Garden of Eden is sometimes questioned, sometimes made fun of. But it also contains, I think, a very deep insight into the spiritual dilemma of being human. It offers a perspective on the process of becoming a human being as we actually experience it, as alienated from the world in a way, from each other, from other creatures, from God, really. God's not directly apparent. But the beginning of that alienation, seen as temptation or disobedience or envy or greed, what the Greeks would call hubris, the pride that causes us to reach too far and fall. The serpent says, you could be like God. Sounds attractive. The direct cause of our alienation, our loneliness, our consistent failure is said to be the knowledge of good and evil, which is kind of odd, really, since knowledge of good and evil would seem to be needed for any kind of moral choice. But the judgment that goes along with that knowledge and is always present in that choice that we make require a stepping back from life in a way. Looking at things objectively, trying to analyze them and determine what's good and what's evil. And it's that standing back involved in that process that brings alienation. So in a way, what it's saying is that it's our consciousness that really makes us fully human, but it's also our consciousness that breaks the original unity with everything. Along with alienation, along with this separation of ourselves as observing subjects, judging some object or other, comes shame, the story says. An awareness of our own vulnerability, an awareness of our nakedness, it says, an awareness that we ourselves can be judged in the same way that we find ourselves judging everything else, which is scary. And so we start the cover-up. Fig leaves, loincloths, automatic weapons, conspicuous consumption, self-righteous, self-aggrandizing pseudo-religion, all the protective moves that we believe keep us safe, but only increase that alienation, build walls. Doesn't matter whether it's a castle or a prison, you're still inside the wall. It didn't have to be this way, the story speculates. And the story is undoubtedly written post facto when people realized that it was this way and they were wondering, why is it this way? It's said there was a time when life was one, when we were one with our environment, just being in the garden. tilling and tending without judgment, without shame, without really a sense of ourselves, without an awareness of death. When I hear this story, I can't help but think of the fact that it could come from some kind of deep memory of that more than 100,000 years we were moving in the world as bands of hunters and gatherers, gathering up what we could eat, finding sustenance as we could, before we settled down to improve everything, to control everything, without an awareness of all the unintended consequences that ended up flowing from our trying to control everything and improve everything. And I can't help but think that it could also come from a deep personal memory, the memory of before we were born, of the inner garden of infancy and childhood that we flowed in until puberty or some other trauma makes us aware of our nakedness, aware of our vulnerability, making us feel like we've always got to watch our back. We've always got to repair the walls to survive. It feels that fearful. Fear can be a gift, but we've come to the place, I think, where the fear is constant, regardless of the threat. So it doesn't ever abate, and in that state, the joy and love of life are killed. That's the perception of human being that's in this story. And there were two paths that people in our tradition at least, and I think other traditions as well, two paths that came away from this human dilemma, came out of an awareness of this dilemma, this experience of alienation and shame, and the belief that it could have been and might still be more unified, less frightening, more loving, more joyful. And one path involves what's essentially trying to get back to paradise, return to paradise, starting from the current condition of an awareness of our situation, the effects of the original alienation, the original sin, as it came to be called, are traced back with the goal of undoing them, calling us to give up greed, lust, violence, pride, and all the rest. We had a list at the beginning of the penitential order. Amen. Lord, have mercy. This way analyzes the fig leaves we've made, trying to discover the cover-up. And I remember Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young singing, "We've got to get ourselves back to the garden." But St. Augustine said that long before that. The problem I find with that approach, and it's a common approach. I mean, you read the penitential order, you read our collect today, there's that sense of this accumulation of bad stuff we've got to get rid of to get back to God. But the problem is that in order to identify the effects of alienation, the marks of original sin, we need to engage in the very act of judgment based on a knowledge of good and evil that got us in trouble in the first place. And the first law of holes says, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And trying to find the right moral code, the right actions and thoughts, the right systems of reward and punishment have failed us again and again and again in the history of the church, the history of society, from the Pharisees and their 613 derived commandments from the 10 to the Puritans, finding this witch and that witch, and trying to put in stocks everybody who was a sinner so they could change, to any advocate of revolution or reform that sees their program as the solution to it all. There's a second path to unity that's drawn less attention, I think, in our mainline, at least Western Christian tradition, but offers, for me, kind of a more hopeful outcome. But it may just be me. It sees the fall from paradise as what's called a necessary fault, a felix culpa, in the words of Thomas Aquinas. It's not an error, it's not a mistake, it's not something that's a punishment for an action that sets us up for more sin and punishment. It calls us to accept the problems that we have, say the problems that come with adolescence. But instead of advocating a return to the womb, it advocates developing a co-creative adulthood, maybe, that moves on from adolescence to an involvement with God that's further down the line. In this path, the goal is, or could be phrased as the kingdom of heaven, conceived not as identical with the Garden of Beginnings, but including all the complexities of life, the joys and the sorrows, the success and the failure, the pleasure and the pain, the healing and the woundedness that come in between birth and death. And some kind of integration of all that. It calls less for moral judgment with its knowledge of good and evil, and more for a discernment and an awareness of the God-given natural flow of life that includes all this stuff. So that the lives we're living aren't seen here as some mistake, as grounded in sin, but as essential components of the kingdom itself that God is bringing together over time. The gospel reading today shows Jesus engaged in this struggle, which I see as an interior struggle. It's a struggle that is needed no matter which path really we choose to take. He faces temptation. The devil, like the servant, is the tempter more than some evil force. That's not part of this story. But the tempter who offers solutions to the problems of being human that carry unintended and hidden consequences that take us way off any path we're following. So for those who are on that first, what might be called Augustinian path, concerned about the world and the temptations of the world, seeking a return to an original blessing, the temptations that Jesus faces are seen as sins that needed to be avoided. Like the turning stone into bread is representative maybe of gluttony or greed, thinking that if we just have more stuff, we'll be okay. Or if we just get the right stuff, the right house, the right car, the right vacation, the right place to live, we won't have to be ashamed. We won't be alienated. Or maybe the sin is like what the second one, temptation that Jesus faced, a kind of self-centered faith, where religious practice really amounts to an attempt to get God to support your agenda. If I throw myself off the temple, well, God will take care of me. I can do whatever I want. God will take care of me. Or maybe it's power. Power with corruption and violence that always comes with it. You just have to compromise a little, The tempter says. Just, you got to live in the real world, right? Adapt to the world. Give the devil his due. You can have it all. If you see life as this sort of walking away from paradise, the gospel just says, turn around. These are all false solutions, leading only to more shame. Now, if you're on the path that understands itself as a journey between paradise and the kingdom of heaven through this valley of the shadow of death, the temptations are seen not so much as evil deeds, but as dead-end paths, as pointless, as illusory. And the gospel, in this case, is seen as a warning sign to find another route. Just, it's not this way. Yeah, and Jesus in the gospel models a response that's appropriate for either situation. And it's shown on the cover of the bulletin. He does nothing. He does nothing. He answers the devil, but not in some kind of long moral, theological debate. It's basically thanks but no thanks. I'll pass on the wealth and the phony faith and the power. He doesn't have an answer at this point. He knows he just has to sit there. He knows that he won't find God just out there in the wilderness with the devil any more than he found God really out in the wilderness with John the Baptist and became some kind of hermit. He goes back into community, back into the world. And waits for it there with his friends and his family and his followers and faces those who are hostile, teaching what comes to him as he's walking the way. He's always on the way. And he's learning his own way as he teaches others the way. So I don't know where you all are at the beginning of Lent, this 40 days. On your way back to the garden or on your way forward to the kingdom, by the river and filled with the Spirit for a while, out in the wilderness facing temptation. But I know you're going one step at a time, one day at a time. wherever you're headed with family and friends, and with facing those who are hostile or indifferent, with your memories and hopes and probably some fear and uncertainty. Lent's a time for all that, to be open to all that. Lent is a time for deep reflection, for self-questioning at heart. But reflection and questioning with an awareness that it's not uncharted territory, that Jesus himself had gone that way before. And he came out of it alive, eternally alive. So be patient with life, be patient with yourself. It can be quite a struggle, but there are angels who will wait upon you. Thanks be to God.